And the story of how I got to the flotilla is kind of where I'm going to start with. As David mentioned, I resigned from the diplomatic corps and the government, the federal government, 7 years ago with the start of the Iraq War. I'd been in the federal government virtually all of my adult life. I started out as joining the military. I spent 29 years in the military, retired as a colonel, and then was in the U.S. Diplomatic Corps for 16 years and served in places such as Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia. I helped reopen the embassy in Afghanistan in 2001, and then I was in Mongolia in March of 2003 when I resigned in opposition to the war in Iraq. Most of that time there were policies of the 8 different presidential administrations under which I served that many of you all were on the streets protesting, starting with the Vietnam War when I joined the military, the Central American wars that the Reagan administration was involved in that you all were marching in the streets, and Gulf War I where many of you marched, and gosh, how many pairs of shoes have you worn out over these decades that many people of our country have challenged the policies of our country. So I'm a newcomer to the ranks of those who criticize the government, having been a part of the government. As David mentioned, when I finally resigned in opposition to primarily the war in Iraq, but I put in my letter of resignation that I was very deeply concerned about the Bush administration's failure to do anything to try to move forward any type of peace process in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I felt it was, and I mentioned in my letter of resignation, that the unbalanced policies of the Bush administration and every U.S. presidential administration has been dangerous for the United States and our national security, and I think it's dangerous for the state of Israel too. And it certainly is for the Palestinians. It has been 62 years of unbelievable harm. So how did I get involved with Gaza, though, specifically? It started 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, with the Israeli attack on Gaza in December of 2008 and January of 2009. The 22-day attack that ended with 1,440 Palestinians that had been killed, 5,000 that had been wounded, 50,000 that had been made homeless. Virtually every major infrastructure of the small area of Gaza, 25 miles long, 5 miles wide, one of the most densely populated places in the world, with 1.5 million people living in that small area. When I saw the pictures, as you all did, not a lot of pictures of what was happening in Gaza, because the Israeli military, as the U.S. military does, limits the number of news people that can go into a war zone. And we saw the photographs of that 22-day attack primarily from Al Jazeera TV that was already in Gaza, and some New York Times reporters that just happened to be there at the time. But most of the reporting that we saw was done from outside, was done from the hills overlooking Gaza from Israel. But still, those limited number of photographs that we saw horrified me as a human being first, but as a military officer, it was astounding that here we had the most sophisticated, the biggest military really in the region, funded by the United States, $3 billion a year that we give in military aid to the Israeli military, that the pounding of Gaza, of a country that, or an area that really had no defenses at all. Not that I at all condone the homemade, unguided rockets that are sent from Gaza that land in Israel and terrify the Israeli citizens that live along the border. And over the last 6 years or so, with thousands of rockets that have actually gone from Gaza into Israel, there tragically have been 30 Israelis that have been killed. But the disproportionate use of force, as the Israelis said, we have to protect Israel from those rockets, and the disproportionate use of force, which ended up killing 1,440 Palestinians, was something that just I couldn't understand. So I and 2 other people in late January of 2009 traveled to Cairo, Egypt, to try to figure out if we could get into Gaza. Very few people were getting into Gaza. Virtually no one through the Israeli side, but a few internationals had been allowed to go into Gaza through the southern border with Egypt, through the Rafah crossing. So Medea Benjamin and Ty Berry of Code Pink Women for Peace and myself flew to Cairo and started figuring out how you get to Rafah to start with, and then what happens when you get to the border. We ended up being with thousands of other people at the border crossing at Rafah, Egypt. All of these people trying to get in, doctors, lawyers, human rights people, convoys of medicine, of food, all trying to get in, and yet virtually nobody was being allowed in. As a part of the Egyptian part of the blockade, the siege of Gaza, the quarantine of Gaza that had been going on for 3 years at that point, where the Israeli government, the Egyptian government, our government, European Union governments had all decided that they were going to put the squeeze on the people of Gaza in order to make the people of Gaza change the government of Gaza. And if you remember back in 2006, there was an election. Parliamentarians were chosen from a political, social, militant group called Hamas, a group that the United States and European countries and Israel says is a terrorist organization. But it was the organization that the people of Gaza voted for because they felt they were not having any real representation by the Palestinian Authority, and primarily the Fatah group. And so they voted to have members of Hamas represent them. Well, that caused big trouble for them because they crossed the line. They crossed, oh gosh, democratically they had crossed the line. They had a democratic election. They elected some people, and other people didn't like it, like the United States government. You know, it's really remarkable. Here we pride ourselves, we're a great democracy, and Israel says it's the only democracy in the Middle East. And yet what do democracies do when other people have democratic elections, but the democracies don't like it? Well, they squeeze the life out of people to try to get those people to overthrow the government of Hamas. So that's really what this blockade and quarantine is all about, is to put such stress on the people of Gaza that they will say to Hamas, get on out of here. We don't want you anymore. We'll put up with somebody else. If you think back 50 years, 45 years maybe, when the United States decided we'd put the blockade around Cuba, and that would force the Cubans to overthrow Fidel Castro. Well, that really worked, didn't it? But why should we, the United States, think that those are the types of tactics that our country should be putting on other people?